All right, kiddos, we are going to take a look at our first notes on Unit 4, Imperfect Competition. I'm going to roll through the PowerPoints just like we would in class. Obviously, it'll probably go a little faster without any questions, without any discussion, but we'll use that for our Zoom session. So as you're looking at this, take a few notes. If something doesn't make sense to you, jot it down and we'll talk about it in our Zoom sessions. I've only got 15 minutes in the screencast thing here, so if I get close to running out of time, that'll kind of wrap up that particular lecture. But you wish it was like that Monday through Friday at school. 15 minutes of lecture would be cool, but anyway. So Unit 4, oh, we are live. I'm taking one time, so whatever happens, happens. Unit 4, Imperfect Competition. Obviously, the last unit, I'm going to scroll through this. We would talk in class about memorizing something versus learning, but I think we've kind of beaten the point about the graphs and learning the graphs. But anyway, as we in class, we studied perfect competition. Matter of fact, we took an entire unit to make sure that we understood all of the characteristics of perfect competition. And this unit is going to cover the other three. All right, and so anything obviously that's not perfect competition is going to be imperfect competition, and so we're going to look at those three in this unit. I won't bore you by going through this slide again, but we're just talking about every product in the market being sold in one of these particular market structures. And so yeah, any of these three are all considered imperfect competition. Now it'll be important when you're answering questions on the test. If it brings up perfect competition versus or this firm is operating in a perfectly competitive marketplace, that would tell us something about our price and all that stuff that we learned. But anyway, we'll jump into monopoly and then we'll review a little bit kind of as we go along so that it makes sense. But from studying U.S. history, most of you should know kind of the characteristics of what a monopoly should look like. If you notice on the lineup here, it's on the complete opposite side of perfect competition. So we would assume that it's got a lot of the opposite characteristics. So a quick look. We talked about De Beers, the diamond company in class, how they can still run a monopoly. Obviously, they're not in the United States where monopolies are illegal. There are some legal monopolies like your electric company, but those are regulated by the government. We will actually talk a little bit more about that here in a little bit too. But anyway, a couple quick characteristics just to make sure we're back on pace. A characteristic of a monopoly is that there's one large firm, so the firm is the market. Hopefully a bell just went off when you're thinking about graphing a monopoly, because in perfect competition we have to graph the firm and the market, or technically the market and then the firm. But with a monopoly, the firm is the market, so we're only going to get one graph, and we'll look at that here in a few minutes. There's a unique product. Obviously, there's no close substitutes. Otherwise, it wouldn't have monopolistic power. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. Very high barriers to entry. Generally, this is the number one thing that makes a monopoly a monopoly. Is the high barriers to entry. It's not easy for other firms to get in that industry. So yeah, I can't get in the diamond business because if I went to the mountains of South America, I probably will not survive my trip because De Beers has paid the tribes off to protect their natural resources. But anyway, so very high barriers of entry. And so yeah. Monopolies are going to be price makers. That's opposite of what we know so far. Monopolies determine the price that they want to charge for their product, and we'll take a closer look at that kind of moving forward. They do some advertising. Obviously, you still got to know about the product and that type of thing, but they're not getting into a major, come buy our product over another, obviously, because they have a unique product. And so they do a little advertising, but not a lot. Let's take a look at some true false and see if these things start to make you kind of question. True or false, all monopolies make a profit. True or false, monopolies are usually efficient. True or false, all monopolies are bad for the economy? True or false, all monopolies are illegal? True or false, monopolies charge the highest price possible? And finally, true or false, the government never prevents monopolies from forming? We'll look back at this at the end, but I'll go ahead and give you a hint. All of these are false. Monopolies don't always make a profit. Monopolies are rarely efficient. 3, monopolies are actually good for the economy. We'll talk about that. Monopolies are not illegal. They are here in the United States for the most part, unless they're regulated. We'll talk about that. Monopolies charge the highest price possible. Well, we know they don't. If they're regulated by the government, like our electric company, they don't charge us the highest price possible. And then we'll see in some instances with number 6 where the government actually allows monopolies to form because it's better for me and you. It's better for me and you that we have one power company coming in our neighborhood instead of 6 power companies all vying for our business and bukus of lines running through the neighborhood, under the ground, from pole to pole, all that good stuff. So yeah, this is a slide talking about the electric companies and why the government does get involved. Generally, if there were more electric companies, then they're advertising to get business, which is going to drive their cost up, and because our demand is inelastic, if the cost gets driven up, then we're going to have to pay more for it. So having one electric company actually keeps the prices low, right? And then economies of scale, if Zach and I were going to get in the power company business, we would have to come up with millions and millions and billions and maybe even trillions of dollars to create a power company. Therefore, we're going to have to start charging a lot of money for power, and it really just doesn't make sense that we would get in that business, because if Georgia Power or Cobb EMC is already charging a really low rate, and then Zach and I have to get in there and pay for all our sunk cost, it just doesn't make sense that we would stay in business very long. So these are known as, and you probably want to write this down, natural monopolies. Okay, these are allowed by the government. They are regulated by the government, so they can't charge any price that they want, and so that's why we have things like the power company, gas and electricity, stuff like that. So let's talk about drawing monopolies. Drawing monopolies they change a little bit from perfect competition, but they're going to have a lot of the similar characteristics we know about. Profit maximizing never changes, right? We know that is throughout all market structures, MR equals MC. But here is the good news. There's only going to be one graph. We talked about that a minute ago, because the firm is the industry. So if we're asked to draw a monopoly, we know that we draw a supply and demand graph. The cost curves are exactly the same. So marginal cost is the same, average total cost is the same, average variable cost is the same, average fixed cost is the same. All of our cost curves are going to be exactly the same, and that's why we spent so much time last unit making sure not only that we knew the cost curves, but we understood the characteristics. So we want to take that knowledge with us into this unit. And then the beauty here is, and this is why we got a tattoo of it, is that the MR equals MC rule still applies, and so that's going to lead us to all of our answers when we do have to take a look at the graphs. Okay, and then even for a monopoly, the shutdown rule still applies. Okay, so that are big characteristics of graphs. One graph, cost curve is the same, MR equals MC still applies, shutdown rule still applies. All right. The main difference is monopolies are going to have a downward sloping demand curve. All right. And for the people who were online yesterday, this is when we learn our monopoly gang sign. I'm trying to get it so the camera, all right. And so when we see a question on a monopoly, or we're asked to graph a monopoly, we immediately think of our monopoly gang sign, and that'll make sense to you here in just a second. Okay, so all imperfectly competitive firms are going to have a downward sloping demand curve. In contrast, perfect competition, Mr. DARP, that demand curve was elastic. Okay, now it's going to be downward sloping, and we'll talk about why that happens here in just a few minutes. And so the reason that happens is because, just like any other business, for a firm to sell more, for quantity demanded to go up, the price has to be lowered, right? Even De Beers, even the power company, if they want to sell more of their product, they must lower their price, and that's going to cause the demand curve, by definition and by rule, to be downward sloping. Okay, this changes the marginal revenue. Think about this: if I charge $100 for my first unit of widgets, I'm the only widget maker in the world, and I'm charging $100 for these widgets, and I want to sell another widget. Just because I'm a monopoly doesn't mean that people have to come and pay $100 for another widget. Okay, so I only sell one. Well, to sell a second one, I got to lower the price. So I lower it to $90, and I sell a second widget. Okay, well, my marginal revenue from 0 to 1 widgets was $100 because I had no revenue. I sold one widget, now I have $100. When I sold the second widget, I sold it for $90. So my total revenue now is $190, but I went from $100 in revenue to $190 in revenue for a marginal revenue change of $90. So for the first unit I had $100 marginal revenue, the second unit I had $90 marginal revenue, and if I'm going to sell a third unit, that's right, you guessed it, the marginal revenue is going to be even lower. So in a monopoly, probably the biggest thing that you'll write, is the reason we got it in red on here, the marginal revenue does not equal the price. Okay, marginal revenue does not equal the price. All right, so let's take a look on the graph why that happens. If we notice our price is $11 for this particular item, nobody demands it, therefore our total revenue is 0, and we have no marginal revenue. Okay, to sell our first unit, we lower our price down to $10. Our total revenue is now $10, and our marginal revenue, we went from 0 to 10. Our marginal revenue is $10. And watch what happens. For that next unit, quantity demanded went up to 2. Our total revenue is now 18, or a marginal revenue, as we went from 10 to 18 units, our marginal revenue went up $8. Okay, so you might ask, why did this happen? Well, because I can't charge one person a price for their electricity because they can pay more and charge someone else less. No, if the government's regulating the pricing, then I have to charge everybody the exact same. And so I'm going to just take you down through here. If you notice, for the for the third unit, it's $8. Fourth unit, $7, and you could just do the math along and along. And if you notice the difference in total revenue for each particular unit, our marginal revenue is decreasing. Okay, and so by the time we get to this point here, we've actually went negative. So anyway, let's take a look. And so this is where we get our monopoly gang sign. All right, find the camera again. All right, it's gonna kind of be at an angle like this. Notice what's happening to price is going down, but notice what's happening to marginal revenue. It's going down at a steeper rate. Okay, and if we recall back to perfect competition, Mr. DARP is an elastic line. Price and marginal revenue is exactly the same. All right, so I'm at about 14.5 minutes, as my little timer says down here in the bottom, and I'm going to wrap up kind of the first version there. I'm going to come right back and just make another one here in a few minutes. So that's actually a really good place to stop on why the marginal revenue is less than the demand. And it's because for us to sell another unit, we have to lower the price. All right, so I'm going to wrap this one up and save it, and then I'll have us another one going here in a second. Monopoly gang sign.